get scared, but interest rates are on the rise.
I'm freaking out.
The stock market has recently entered into bear territory.
Double freaking.
You got to prepare your church. What are you going to do for a potential recession? We're not economists, but there are a lot of economists giving some warnings. So we're going to talk about that on today's episode. 6 prudent practices to prepare your church budget for a potential economic recession. How do you like that for alliteration, Dad?
I did not catch it until you said it. Now that you said it, it simply says sensation.
It was intentional. And as you have taught me well, you need a hook so that people will pay attention and listen. So this is a very real thing. It is not a made up thing. And some of you are already living this. There might be an economic downturn on the way. And, we'll talk about that. But before we do, I certainly want to talk about our sponsor. Daddy, ever heard of Tyndale?
I have not just heard about Tyndale. I love Tyndale, and I want you to love them too.
I do. They're an incredible partner of ours. We want our listeners to know about Tyndale, especially one of their new books, Another Gospel by Alyssa Childers. Have you encountered the ideas of progressive Christianity, but you aren't sure how to respond? We've got a popular author, blogger, and speaker, Alyssa Childers, and she brings you Another Gospel, the book and curriculum for anyone wanting to explore the nuanced topic of progressive Christianity. Here's what Lee Strobel says, very well-known and respected figure in Christianity. He says, this may be the most influential book you read this year. So, that's a pretty high endorsement. In a culture of endless questions, you need solid answers. Alyssa will show you how to determine and rest in what is unmistakably true. So, Another Gospel by Alyssa Childers. You can visit alyssachilders.com to learn more. We've got a link in the show notes as well. So, go check the book out and go check out Alyssa's website. We'd love for you to be a part of that.
Sam, I don't know if you were aware of it at the time, but when I was dean at Southern Seminary, I really became close to Lee Strobel and brought him into my class as a good
I remember. Yes. Now that you mention it, I remember it. I was not there in your class, though.
Well, we both have this passion that is not just ebbing right now; is flowing strong with me. Asking the question, "Where is evangelism?" And he's just been so consistent in that. And the reason he loves his Tyndale book, obviously, it's a good book, but he knows and believes in the true gospel. And he knows Alyssa is talking about the progressive Christianity, which is another gospel, which is not the gospel at all. So I'm looking forward to reading that because anything Lee recommends, I want to listen.
I agree. I think it's a high endorsement, and I think it'd be good for our audience to go check it out. So alyssachilders.com.
So let's talk about this recession that you have predicted with certainty.
Yes. So let's get our terms right. A recession is 2 quarters of negative GDP growth. A bear market is a 20% drop in the stock market, typically the S&P. We're there in the bear market territory. At least we've kind of touched on it at the time of this recording. Likely going to have some form of a recession. At least that's what many of the economists are saying, which means changes to what the current path has been up to this point in terms of the economy. You got to prepare your church. You got to get ready. Yep. The first thing that you can do, I love this first point, zero-based budgeting. It is time. If you have not started the practice of zero-based budgeting, now is the time.
We have talked about this many, many times. We've written about it. We've spoken about it. And zero-based budgeting may end up being an exercise that has a bit of theoretical in it, but it will also have a lot of current practical applications. Zero budgeting means you start your budget at zero and you ask the question, what would this budget be if we did not have other constraints or other expenses? And even though you may not be able to get to the point that would be exactly like your ideal budget, you start there every time. The mistake we make is that we start with expenses and say, how much more are we going to spend? We don't do that personally. We should not do that with our churches, or at least we shouldn't do it personally.
Yeah, in zero-based budgeting, you're resetting to zero. Every budget resets to zero. And then you add things back in, and you do that every year. It's a great practice. Most churches will, well, not most, I shouldn't say that. There's a lot of churches that I know of that'll just look at whatever was last year and just add a percentage to it. Don't
Yep.
do across the board increases. Don't do it.
Basically, that's unbiblical because you're taking a talent and burying it. You're not asking what is the best stewardship.
Yes. Yeah, if you just say, well, we expect, we're thinking maybe 3% more this year, you're kind of spitballing it. We're just going to give everybody a 3% increase to their ministry budget. That's not a wise thing to do, because somebody in their budget may have like a big expense this year that they don't need the next year, and all that you're doing is just putting unnecessary funds towards something that's unneeded. So zero-based budgeting
Exactly.
allows you to reset everything and then ask the question, okay, what do we need this year?
Totally. Totally.
The second point is to project revenue before considering expenses.
And maybe that today we need to be a little more cautious on the revenue projections that we have if we're about to enter a recession. We know we're in high inflation right now. So you're exactly right. Let's go to revenue first, and then let's go to expenses afterwards. I want to just give a plug right now, because one of our partners, Church Growth Services, that what they're doing right now, Sam, is they're working with churches to help them on the revenue side. They're 7 out of 10 churches are struggling to fund their ministry, and what Church Growth Services is doing is they're saying, okay, we're going to address the revenue issue head on, and basically what they do is they provide the training for you to do it. And they have this incredible class called Grow Generosity 101 training. I just wanted to put that plug in because many of the stewardship consultants, or many of those who help with fundraising, is primarily a capital issue. Well, with Church Growth Services, they're helping you address the revenue issue in your budget. I just wanted to put that plug in because I know that Mike Saddlemeyer and the team at Church Growth Services are doing that. I know I'm getting us off track a little bit, but I did want to mention that. I know Amy will put it in the show notes because I just
Yeah,
mentioned it.
I think it's a good mention. Grow Generosity 101 is an excellent training program. Would love for our audience to go give it a look. And when you're talking about projecting revenues before expenses, well, this is how most people do their home budgets. You don't just say, what do I want to spend this year? You ask yourself the question, what am I going to make this year? And then you match your expenses to your budget, um, to your income. Churches need to do the same thing. You don't need to just increase budgets just for the sake of increasing them. Don't do across the board increases. The other thing that you can do, point number 3 here, getting your church ready, is to set the budget slightly lower than your actual revenue from the previous year. So let's say you took in $1.5 million. And then you say, okay, we're going to budget for 3% less than that to make sure that we cash flow well. Wise or not, Dad?
I want to be a devil's advocate and let you respond to the devil's advocate.
Sure.
But Sam, if you budget slightly lower than your actual revenue from the previous year, you don't have any faith. All you're doing is just being overly cautious and not seeing how God will work. So that is my counterpoint that I don't really believe, but I know that there are a few people out there
I've
thinking
heard
that.
of what is this, faith-based budgeting. I've heard that term before, and I would say, so I have a lot of faith, so I want to set the budget 10 times higher. We brought in $1 million. I want to set a $10 million budget because I got a lot of faith. How do you feel about that?
Well, that will give clarity to maybe why not. And here's my response to it. Faith-based budgeting lower than previous year's revenue is not a step back in faith. It is good stewardship, and you can continue to have faith that you will overshoot it. You're just not spending it in the budget ahead of time.
Yes, and I'm not saying that you need to take 10 or 20% out of your budget, but something to consider is go back and look how much your revenue decreased in the last recession. So go look at '06 numbers for your church and what you brought in, and then look at '08 and '09, for instance, and see what did it decrease, and if it did, to what degree, what was the percentage. And I don't think things are going to be as bad as '08, '09. Personally, that's just my own personal take. um, but you might say, okay, we lost 5% in the Great Recession in terms of revenue. We're going to cut 2.5% out of next year's budget
Fair
just
enough.
to make sure. So you can actually
Fair enough.
quantify this a little bit. See what you lost the last time we had a recession, and then maybe it's not going to be as bad, so you don't take as much out, but you prepare for it that way.
And this fourth point is timely. It's just timely. Consider the impact of inflation on the personnel budget. As we are recording this, we're about at 8.4% inflation. Using some of the government's measurements, I think we're really higher than that with other things that are not in that inflation number. But we're at least at 8+% inflation right now. Extremely high inflation from the days we were at 0, 1, and 2%. So what does that do to your personnel budget? How do you take care of your people who are experiencing these inflationary pressures, and then funding them where they can take care of them without breaking the bank of your own church? There's the challenge.
Yeah, if you haven't given pay raises in a while, you're going to need to this year. And they're likely going to need to be higher than what you would typically do because of the rate of inflation. So before you sit down and start doing your ministry budgets, make sure that you have properly taken care of your staff this year. The uh, inflation is very high, and cost of living increases need to reflect the inflation that's out there. So I would actually, after I project revenues, my first place I go to is the personnel budget, because that's the biggest chunk typically in most churches, um, that that you need to start with. So ask yourself the question, what kind of cost of living increases and pay raises are we going to give people this year, and make sure you consider that impact before you start working on other things.
Theoretically, a church is not giving a merit raise if it gives a raise under 8.5%. I do not expect churches to give those level of raises, but that is just an example of the impact of inflation. If you give a 5% raise, a 4%, or 6%, in the current environment, you are helping them try to stay close, but you're not catching up with inflation.
Yeah, and just so people understand what inflation is, let's say you have $100 in the bank that's cash. If inflation's at 8%, you lose $8 every year on that $100.
That 100 becomes 92 in purchasing power.
Yes. So this is a very real thing. Groceries are higher. I know that. I have lots of children in my house, 5, and it's expensive. Gas is higher. The
1, 2, 3, 4. Am I missing a kid? I mean, did you pick up a grandchild I don't know about?
uh, don't for,
One.
don't forget Journey, our foster daughter.
I didn't know how much she was staying with y'all.
Still quite a bit.
Is she going? Okay. Okay.
And
Well,
and
good for Journey.
and she doesn't come with lunch money when she comes to our house.
I've seen that girl eat.
Yeah, she eats our food, and we're glad
Yes.
for her too. So inflation's very real. You need to do something for your staff this year. Just make sure that you take that into account before you do your budget. Point 5 is critical. It's critical in good times and bad times. Make sure you understand the timing of your expenses for the sake of cash flow.
Yeah, you could have a big loan payment. You could have a big capital expense. You could be planning to replace air conditioned units. You could be replacing a roof. it's not always this neat little flow of expenses that you can plan for the same thing every month. And so if your church, let's say you have a $200,000 budget, let's make it easy, 240,000, so you have a $20,000 month coming in. Don't think that you can have $20,000 in normal ongoing expenses, because that won't cover the big ones when they come in.
Yeah, I think of things like summer camps and VBS and all the things that churches do in the summer when offerings can be lighter for many churches. Make sure that you know when expenses will hit and when your revenue dips, if it dips. I've heard of churches that can get 20 and 30% of their revenue in the month of December.
Wow,
I mean, I was just talking
that's
with
true.
one early this week that said we get about 25% of our total giving in the month of December.
I can see
Well,
that.
that's a cash flow issue because you still have to pay the utility bill throughout the months of the year.
Yes.
So you can't wait till December to pay it all. So as you're budgeting, it's not only that this ministry has $10,000 in the budget. It's when are you going to spend that $10,000, and making sure that every ministry isn't spending their budget all at the same time. Uh,
Hey, let me interject something. You remember the Twilight Zone? I know it was around in the '60s, but have you seen reruns at
I,
all?
I know of the Twilight Zone, and I have seen
Like
reruns.
the theme song is kind of like Amy saying, yeah, she remembers Rod Serling, and he gets up there in his black suit, and he just makes you scared looking at him. You remember some of those Twilight Zone moments when you're talking about something and all of a sudden an ad shows up on your smartphone of that which you're just talking about, and you know that Facebook or Amazon is listening in.
Oh,
You've had those
oh, I have
moments?
a very specific one. My daughter Maggie was talking about this gift that someone had given her for her birthday, and it tracks elephants. Like, it gets your own elephant, and it's got a GPS tracker on it, and she can always see where her elephant is.
It tracks elephants.
Yeah, somebody's tagged. Well, they say they've tagged elephants somewhere in Africa, and it follows the herd. And so her elephant.
I've never heard of such.
Well, anyway, I am. She just talked to me about it. I am getting so many advertisements for this stinking GPS elephant tracker. I've never even been to the website. Every Facebook ad is, "Do you want to track an elephant?" I'm like, "No," but I did talk to my daughter about it. So, yes, everyone who kind of has the tinfoil on their head when it comes to, is your computer listening? Is Facebook listening? It is, and I can prove it.
Okay, Sam, you may think why I mentioned that. What does that have to do with what we're talking about?
I
You
don't
and
know.
I, I know I shouldn't be looking at text during the podcast, but you and I just received a text from your youngest brother, Jess.
Okay.
Rachel and I are doing a whole new budget now because of inflation.
Yeah. Well, I am
It's in your
too.
text.
It's a very real
I
thing.
know, but it showed up during this podcast.
Well, Jess must be listening.
It's like he's giving a commentary on our podcast as we're recording it. We're doing a new budget.
That's funny. That's really funny.
Yes, it is. Okay, enough of that. But yeah, make sure you understand the timing of cash for cash flow purposes. And this expense, these two categories are the big gotchas. Additional debt, because usually it's going to be there while your debt payments, and new personnel, particularly those that are hired ongoing, not just a contract worker short term, but ongoing. Be extremely careful with these, because one of them you can't get rid of without going bankrupt, which you don't want to do, which is debt. And the other one you don't want to get rid of, which is new personnel. You have to be extremely careful there. Those are not as discretionary as you may think they are.
Yes. And if you have to choose between paying the bank or paying your people, you know what the bank's going to say.
You don't have a choice legally.
Yes, you don't. You're going to have to fulfill your debt obligations. So and now here's the thing: if your church is growing, extraordinarily, the budget's up, and you need to build, hey, that's great, good for you. I would just say, be careful with any significant debt that you may take on, and be careful with that. Maybe you're at 55% of your personnel budget to total budget. and you're like, man, I really need an executive pastor. Can we push this personnel budget to 65% to total budget? I would say no. This is absolutely
Don't do it.
not the year to do it. But I do have a solution if you're like, man, we really could use some help. That's belay. Belay would be a
Yes,
very good option as you're
absolutely.
considering your church budget. So I know we've utilized belay here at
Multiple
Church
times.
Answers. So we've got a link in the show notes. Make sure
Th-
you go check them out if you're thinking about
And the thing about using a place like Belay, Sam, I would never want this to happen. I'm thinking about we have one Belay person right now, and she's doing an incredible job. So I don't anticipate it would ever happen. But if we didn't have an incredible person, all we do is call up Belay and say, "Nah, it's not working. We're going to turn it off," just like that.
Yeah, that's pretty rare though. They do a good job of matching.
They really do. They really. We could go on and on about that. I know we're going down these trails, but these are really. I mean, when you talk about church growth services, when you talk about Belay, we're talking about things that can be used right now in the context of
Well,
these
that's what we do.
budgets.
We give people an action item. We present a problem, and then here's your solution.
Yep.
So zero-based budgeting, practice zero-based budgeting. Project your revenue first before your expenses. Set your budget slightly lower than your actual revenue from the previous year. Don't forget about inflation with your personnel, and check your timing of your expenses, and then ask yourself the question: is this really the time to be adding a lot of debt or making a big hire? There you go. Now you're
Well,
ready. Now you're
thank you
prepared
for
for the
being
potential economic recessions with these prudent practices, to use the alliteration.
okay. Well, you've heard from Mr. Dr. Gloom and Doom, Sam Rayner, as we begin to close out this with a bit of hope. Hey, as our final sponsor, I cannot tell you the level of excitement that I have about Church Answers University. It will launch on August 1, which is less than a week away from
Woohoo!
the release of this podcast. And we're already having great enrollment. We're already having a lot of registration. And this is a place where you can train those or provide training for those who don't have seminary degrees, don't have college degrees in ministry, whether they're BIVO or whether they're multi staff. We're doing this with pastors in Africa. I mean, it's blowing me away how God is opening the doors, and it is highly affordable. I mean, it's just you're not going to find anything that's affordable. It's highly accessible because it's digital, it's online, and it's highly attainable. You can get this in 9 months. You can get this complete certification. It's the new wave of ministry training, and it is the new wave of ministry education. So we're about to launch this thing, and I'm just incredibly enthused about it. Hey, go to churchanswers.university. You also have 6 more days to save $75 on the enrollment. So go on and do that too. That door is about to close. Church Answers University, probably, Sam, is one of the most significant things we've done in the history of Church Answers.
It's definitely a very large endeavor for us, and I am just as excited as you are.
And we're partnering with Tyndale on it, and Tyndale is providing all of the books included in the total price. So
Can't beat that.
really, really good thing. So go to churchanswers.university to learn more. Thank you for being at Church Answers. You got questions, we got answers. That's what we love to say. We are Church Answers, and continue to be with us as we talk about things that help the church as we work together for your church to become healthier together.